This is the Relate.online podcast. I'm your host, Dan Gummo, and we're going to explore how to make relationships awesome. We're going to talk to experts, we're going to have questions and answers, and we're going to have fun. So stay around. At Relate, our mission is to help couples create amazing, connected, and fulfilling relationships. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me at the Relate.online podcast. Dan Gummo, your host. I have special guest David Elliott with me today, who is an addiction specialist, and Stephen Dromgool, who is Relate's director and relationship expert. And what we're talking about today is a thorny, controversial topic of sex and pornography addiction.
Yeah, hi guys, and welcome. My name is David Elliott, and I'm addiction specialist, among other things as well. And I'm happy to be here to support this cause because I think this is a really important topic to address. Sex is one of the most beautiful things in life and the most, fulfilling aspects of relationships. And so when things go wrong and become problematic and become deeply distressing to couples, and I think it's important to be able to demystify some of the issues and give people some practical solutions that they can work on to find out, are they participating in healthy sex with themselves and their partner? And if it's not, what can they do about that? How can they get the support that I need? Yeah, I think there's a couple different aspects here that are really important. And one is that there's, in our societies, there's kind of a problematic relationship with sexuality. We have a lot of sexualized media, a lot of pornography that's available, a lot of sexual services, a lot of confusing elements that are out in society that can tend to put pressure on or contaminate the innocence of the sex that a couple would want to express with themselves. And so it's kind of like we're up against quite a lot in the world. And so I'm really happy to help support couples in the mission to be able to find the sex that works for them, that feels like it's adding to their relationship and is bringing more fulfillment to them. Stephen?
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, David, is so true because I think this is an area that is having lots of very real world consequences for people, and there's a lot of uncertainty because of all of those different messages, and so it creates a lot of confusion and a lot of fear. And so we may have you may be listening to this because this is something that you're struggling with as a user, and you might feel angry or defensive or cornered or ashamed or all of those things, and equally you may be a partner who's discovered this and you didn't know this, and it feels like it's a discovery that changes everything. And so there can be a lot of again, terror, uncertainty, disgust, a lot of fear. What does this mean? What does it not mean? How do we find that stuff out? And jumping on the internet is going to give you a lot of very different answers to those same questions. And the kind of challenge that we have when we're working with couples around is to help them find answers that support them, that support the relationship. And this is an area that is pretty uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people to talk about, but it's an area that's not going away quickly by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, so I guess, David, I think my first question is, what exactly is porn and sex addiction? I mean, is sex addiction the guy who wants to have sex more than 4 times a week? I mean, what do we got here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you started to get to it, which is a lot of what this is based on the amount that it happens. And then really, as it is with other sort of addictive behavior, is it problematic for people, right? Is it causing them harm? Because on the spectrum of sexual expression, there's a lot of different areas. Some people tend to lean toward not having much sex at all, and that's okay for them, and they don't have a problem with that. Other people, they need to have sex every day, and that works for them, and so that's something that can work. Oftentimes in coupleships, what can happen is that you have maybe an imbalance. In the beginning, it sort of can have lots of sex, and then as things settle in, maybe one partner wants more sex than the other person does, and that can create a bit of conflict. Now, again, that's not necessarily problematic and not necessarily based on what addiction is. Addiction is usually something that is progressive and that is causing harm. And it's similar, I think, in looking at porn and sex addiction, I often think about food addiction, right? Because that's a really good parallel as far as processes go. And in food addiction, it's sort of the similar type of thing where you have somebody who's sort of usually eating too much It doesn't work for them. They've lost track of their healthy eating patterns, or they're eating too little and it's restricting. In all cases, though, what we find is that usually somebody is trying to avoid something. Some sort of issues are going on for them, and they've used some natural process, like having a good meal or participating in sex, as something that begins as something that can offer a comfort, however healthy it may be in the beginning, and then can become progressive as they continue to avoid what's going on for them and continue to lean against something that's a natural process of the body that can then cause real problems for themselves and for other people, in particular their partners, but also, can cause legal problems, problems in the workplace. There's a number of different aspects of this, the way that it manifests, and that there's a lot of sort of temptations in the world too, where someone can find themselves just sort of enjoying a romantic novel or movies, and then ending up sort of consuming 10 hours of their day or all night long on porn sites, and then missing work the next day or being unavailable to their partner, right? So it's really about a spectrum, and I think that it's important. Usually people know, I know I have a sex addiction, or I know my partner has that, but it's also really helpful to have some sort of questions to be able to look at and give this some time to be able to see, is this really a problem for me? And one of the ways, if you don't mind, I'll continue a little bit. One of the ways that you can tell whether you have an addiction in any area is you just try to withhold that for a while. Like, give yourself a 30-day window of saying, I'm not going to use porn, or I'm not going to be sexual for 30 days. Similar to like if you were wondering if you were an alcoholic, give yourself a bit of time away from it to see. And then if you find that you're climbing the walls, it's creating a lot of emotional distress for you, anxiety and depression, a lot of irritation. It could be then that you're getting at some of these emotional things that you've been avoiding by using sex or porn. Yeah. So that's some of my initial thoughts.
Well, yeah, and I think the challenge you kind of have with that is, if you look at the literature and stuff, is that there isn't, there's not a clearly established sex and porn addiction criteria. And if you look at what different people will say, it can be, widely different. Different statements. So, according to some of the CSAT material, 70% of men are addicted to porn. Which is a little problematic at that point in time to try and come and get some buy-in at that point in time, because at that point in time, well, if it's 70%, that seems fairly normal. And so, what David was saying about that the progressive nature, the extent to which it's linked to an avoidant behavior, that's a really kind of important thing. I think one of the best definitions I heard was the V6 engine bicycle brakes. So that thing where, there's an element of loss of control. I start here and I end up somewhere where I don't want to be. And I think in any area, whether it's porn or food or alcohol or whatever, that pattern where we are moving into a behavior that's destructive is something that is that is something that we want to look at, because, in relationships, in order to be able to trust our partner, we need to feel that we kind of know what's going on, going on for that. But it certainly is a problem in this area, in that depending on the resources you look at or the person you speak to, you can get lots of different opinions in terms of that. And and sometimes those opinions actually tend to increase distress for partners, increase distress, or actually sometimes decrease engagement for the person who's using the porn or using the sex.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it's a lot of different attitudes out there in the world, Dan.
Well, I just imagined. I heard you say, David, that when someone has a sexual porn addiction, they know it, right? And their partners probably know it. But I've also heard a lot of times when a relationship isn't working very well, that one partner or the other say, well, the other one, they want to have sex too much, or they look at pornography too much, or they'll claim that the other person is an addict. And how do you differentiate or pair this apart? How do you know that, okay, this is actually a sexual pornography addiction, as opposed to, oh, we're using it as a coping skill to make up for lost connection or some other issue like that?
That's a great question, Dan. And I think that, it's true. I mean, sometimes there's the case where, couples get in a position where they're facing issues with their intimacy in general, and they don't know how to resolve it. And that, they begin to withdraw emotionally from each other or create kind of contentiousness. And sex is a deeply intimate thing with your partner. I mean, you're very vulnerable and you're very much together. And so then sex can, in some cases, become more automatic because you can kind of let the body take over. And then, and then people can then feel like they're more dissociating or they're less present with their partner and themselves in sex. So maybe then it's feeling less enriching and it's less like a togetherness experience and more like, parallel play, if you will, or on the worst case, using each other and sort of exploiting. And it's not that people are necessarily doing that on purpose to cause harm or that they're saying, well, I'm just going to avoid. I think it's kind of a natural consequence of intimacy. Sometimes people get into a space where they're finding that there's something that's coming up. They're not quite trusting or they're not quite feeling the same connection. And then oftentimes it's sex is where it manifests because that's the place where they happen to be the most intimate with each other. So yeah, so it's important, I think, to have some sort of objective idea about that. It's important to have some support. That's why people usually come to therapy, watch a video like this, get an idea, let these thoughts kind of flesh themselves out to see, because it can be an emotional topic and it can affect our ability to make decisions because we get really triggered. Hey, I'm really hurt by what's happening in my partnership. And, and it can affect our judgment as far as how do I look at my own part in this? And I think you'll see as we continue this conversation that whoever is the sex addict, or if there's an issue with porn in the coupleship, both persons have a role to play and their own part to play. It's not just around fixing the other person. How can I make you have more sex or less sex with me or treat me a different way? But more that what is it about myself that I need to learn? How do I need to step into being more an adult, say, to be the one that's helping to support this relationship boat that we're creating together, right? And then how is it that I need to state my truth in there about things that work for me and don't work with me? People may drift back into patterns of complacency and just allowing things to happen and waiting till they get to more of a boiling point and then sort of losing track of those basic things you discover in a partnership, which is kind of needs management. How do you ask for what you want? How do you communicate when things are working or not working for you?
Yeah, so I want to go back to, you were talking about this whole thing of scapegoating, and this is something that in the literature is has really been an issue where people basically they were dealing particularly in terms of schizophrenia research and stuff, where they identified one person as a scapegoat in the relationship, and so kind of like everything that goes wrong in the relationship essentially get dumped on that one person. So it's a well-known psychological phenomena, and it also ties into another thing called the Cartman triangle, which we're not going to talk about now. But I can imagine that you might have a partner watching this and kind of sort of like bristling, like feeling like, oh, so you're saying that this is my fault. And it's pretty common that if someone is using some using whether it's porn or sex or whatever it is, maybe saying, well, look, like you're just crazy, you're oversensitive, you're overthinking this. And so like there can be an element of gaslighting that goes along with that. So that can be really, really challenging. And so that's one of the reasons why when we're looking at this, like every couple is different, and it's a complex thing. Some people are using because there's been trauma in their past. Some people are using because it's a habitual pattern. Most of us, particularly as guys, sex wasn't something we were talking about with our parents when we discovered masturbation or we discovered porn, or and most of us started there rather than having sexual encounters with real people. And again, it was the secret kind of hidden thing. And so particularly for guys, it's very common that there's a lot of compartmentalizing. And so that's a conditioned response, that sex is something that we do with ourselves, that we do it, we do it in secret, we're not talking about it. There may be shame, there may be not shame. And in fact, I was listening to you, David, and noticing you were kind of like raising all these different topics, and I can hear myself doing the same thing right now. So, but I was just thinking of that research that talks about the link between the label of sex and porn addiction and religious background. That that there's a very high correlation between that because of the spiritual or the moral conflict that has. So there's a lot of complexity. So like when you're working with couples, you're kind of sifting through a lot. It's not sort of like a cookie cutter approach, is it?
Yeah, and I think that, addiction is a real thing and affects couples, and it's a serious condition. It's like, and one of the things that's really easy to get into a situation of sort of adding it to another complaint that you might have of that person, as though they should be able to just sort of get smarter or get themselves under control. Whereas addiction is typically characterized by compulsion, and the person literally is out of control. And I think you nailed it really, really well, especially for men. Coming together in a coupleship, things can be really great in the beginning. You have great sex, you're just getting to know each other. And then there's sort of a coming into a familiar pattern, a more longer term pattern. And those are places when emotional intimacy takes more prominence. And for many of us, that's a real challenging frontier. And so sex addiction can be a way of trying to manage having difficulty being able to share who you are with someone, to make room for who they are in a relationship. And you can get a bit distracted there.
When that happened, the response when a partner discovers, oh my God, you're looking at that, you've been doing this, this is, so appalling and so not something that I would be doing, that often that there's this shaming, you're wrong, you're disgusting, you have to stop this, we're going to escalate the threats, all of that kind of thing. And if you are looking at addiction or some kind of compulsivity, the roots of that behavior are typically back in childhood. So you're not actually dealing with an adult part of the brain that's logically saying, hey, I think it would be a real great idea to go into my office and lock the doors and masturbate while I watch porn for 10 hours. That we're not dealing with that part of the brain. We're dealing with quite a young part of the brain that feels overwhelmed, that feels criticized, that feels alone, that feels terrified, that's traumatized or whatever, and has an old pattern or an old way of trying to comfort themselves. And so, often the intuitive responses that couples would use for kind of like vice management or play or pleasure management, they just don't work with addiction. And so if you are dealing with compulsivity or addiction, the skill set that you need to use is actually different. And it doesn't mean that someone's a bad person or that they're not trying or they don't care about the relationship. It just means you need to approach it from a different perspective. Sorry, Dan.
Well, I was just going to try to summarize what I was hearing you say. For the both of you, what it sounds like is if you know there's an addiction, you need to get help directly for that. If the relationship has a struggle, then the first step really, either way, is to make sure the relationship is well, to do some couples work, to get both sexuality and any other type of intimate behavior kind of in the open, so it feels good and so it can be shared. So that way the shame doesn't kind of keep pushing along compulsive behaviors. So I guess I imagine most of the folks who are listening to this, they might be wondering like, okay, if this is happening in my family, what do I do next? So first suggestions there.
Well, can I just take what you said, because I want to add something to it, because the reason we want to see both people together is as a partner, you have an insight into the way that your partner operates in the world, not just around this behavior, which might have been secret, you might not have known about, but you have a whole insight, you have a whole history. The partner that you chose, that's going to be really relevant to, because that often gives us an insight into into the background of the addict, who may not have too much of a handle, on that. So there's a lot of information that you kind of bring in. And so by coming in together, then we can get a sense of, hey, what's going on? We can see what the vulnerability is. So if someone's acting out and going and having unprotected sex with lots of people, there's a very real, very tangible safety safety implications for the partner. And so, what needs to be done, in terms of that. So yeah, and because most addiction happens in the context of relational wounding, of relational hurts, of relational vulnerabilities, and relational trauma, what we're really trying to find out is that the current relationship is not consciously or unconsciously replicating that pattern, so we can set up a contact that is safe enough in order for things to move forward. Yeah, David.
Wow, there's a lot of material here. I think that, and there's a real richness in this place. I think there's a couple different places that I go with this, and help me to dial in if there feels like one we should go for our next topic. The one really is this place around how when you're in a coupleship with someone, for many people, that's the most intimate they've ever been in their lives since they've been a child, and they're really learning about themselves as they're going through this process. And sometimes that there could be, just natural, normal learning curves, as we all have, and other times they can blossom into behaviors that are very problematic and can cause real issues. And so I think that it's important. I think the key thing here is this balance between the immediacy of something that can really cause harm. You can really cause harm to yourself and your family by participating in sex addiction, right? People using porn at work and getting fired. These things really happen. People using more destructive patterns or repetitive use of sex in a way that causes them real harm. And it's important to be able to identify that right away and to be able to try to address that right away. And then this other piece I think we're getting at, which is that there's no such thing as sort of one person. Addiction may be affecting the coupleship and one person may be an addict, but there's no such thing as one person with the issue and the other person without. So there really needs to be a balance there. And this thing around, it's really easy to feel defensive in a relationship and get to a place of, well, I see that they're doing this problem, and to really support couples coming into the frame of, yes, this person is doing this issue that is really causing me distress, but I have a part to play here. I'm an adult in this relationship. I may be affected by childhood patterns that are overwhelming, but I'm an adult who can take action today for myself. How do I take care of myself in this situation? And in particular for the person who's not affected, who's not the sex addict, say, their task is largely how do they take care of themselves and take less of the focus on their partner changing in order for them to feel different.
You actually preempted my question. So two parts. One is, what is the prognosis? Like, how many people recover from sex and pornography addiction? That's one question. And the other question is, so what about the partner? What is the suggestion for them? Where do they get help?
I could speak just a little bit to this. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Stephen. I think Stephen started this earlier. There's a lot of confusion out there in the literature as far as what constitutes sex addiction and then recidivism and all those fancy therapy terms as far as how do people recover. In my experience, it is when someone has a serious determination to address any sort of addictive pattern, that they can find success in that when they continue to move forward in their passion to do something about it. And I think to really frame the seriousness of what it is that they're looking at. I mean, I wouldn't want to use, say, a cancer diagnosis as something, but it's very serious. When you're affected by an addiction, it takes a lot of work. It's not just a weekend course or something. So but it doesn't mean you have to despair, because there's a lot of help out there and it really is possible. I think that's one of the things we're finding in this new generation of people, is that it really is possible to address a lot of compulsive destructive behaviors by changing one's lifestyle and by participating in life in a way that's adding more self-care and self-awareness and getting oneself more connected. So yes, I think it's well, yes, we are profoundly affected by sex addiction and other addictions in our societies, and there is proven workable methods to be able to get relief, and not just relief from addiction, but toward that more long-term goal. How do I find purpose and meaning? How do I find a rich relationship and build a beautiful partnership with my partner? And I'll save that second part, what does the partner do? Because I'd really like to hear what Stephen has to say.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, David. And the thing that I keep on thinking in terms of this is a huge continuum of need vulnerability, the depth, of the struggle, and I think of Gabor Mate's work, where he's working with heroin addicts and people with profound long-term addiction, and he was talking about his addiction to buying classical music. And in one of his books, and people were like, "What the hell? That's not an addiction." And he's just saying it's following exactly the same process. And so the wounding is there, the expression of that is different. But when I think about addiction, or more when I think about people with pain who have a persistent comfort strategy that they're using, the solution is around learning to take care of themselves. Now, there's always going to be that habit that sits in the background that's been there for 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years. And depending on how long that habit it's going to be, the easier it can be to sort of slip back into that habit. But fundamentally, addiction does not meet our core human needs for connection, to feel safe, to feel secure, to manage the painful feelings that happen in our body with loneliness. There's all of those kind of things. And I love what you said there, David, when someone makes a powerful determination. So when someone comes in and they're like, "I don't want this anymore," like the cost of this pleasure is too high now. This has come out. I'm risking my family. I'm risking, my relationship with my children. All of those kind of things. Then what we can see is that people are suddenly like this thing that they've never been able to stop for more than a day or two at a time, and suddenly it's a week, it's 2 weeks, it's 30 days, it's 60 days, it's 6 months, and and suddenly it's kind of like there's all this energy that's kind of freed up, to be in the world in different ways. There's also tends to be some big feelings that come up. And so having that support, and like David, you're deeply embedded in the 12-step community, all over the world. And so that and that resource of just being able to have those groups where you can show up and say, "Hey, my name's Stephen, I'm having a shit day today. Today is not a good day." And now some people use a 12-step group, some people use other groups, but it is really about trying to create the relationship bubble is safe, and then to move that out into the community, to men's groups, to women's groups, to 12-step groups, to church communities, whatever it is. And couples do that in different ways. But that thing that you were saying, when there is a strong determination, when there is a couple who will stand together, and there is access to a supportive community, then the potential is there, for powerful change to happen.
Just very quickly to line up with this, David, you were speaking about meaning and purpose, and Stephen, you're talking about AA communities or other communities to work with, right? And our sense of meaning and purpose is co-created with others around us. And then on the other hand of that, shame is a relational emotion meant to hide ourselves. And just for the purposes of this video, because I imagine there's some people out there listening who struggle with shame around this, just a couple words on how to start managing shame, and then to connect yourself with the right people to start helping yourself. Sorry.
David,
right. That's just such a great topic, right? I mean, isn't it? Then shame is the currency of the desperate, and people tend to hide the fact that they're in it, and they don't know that they're there. And how terrifying it can be just to be able to even name you use the word shame. And I'm glad that you did, because shame is like a persistent feeling that there's something wrong with me. That's what's going to explain all these problems that I'm having. And that often arises in childhood, when someone can't help a child understand that it's not about them. And it's so overwhelming that they go toward, there must be something wrong with me. I'm broken. I just can't do this. And it's also a way to be able to deflect yourself from being able to do something about what you're working on, because you can always just say, "Well, I'm a piece of crap," and that's really the problem. And you're just going to have to deal with that, right? And so this can be a real logjam in a relationship. And I think that Gabor Mate, you mentioned him earlier, and others who have said that the cure for addiction is connection. And this is really well established. A lot of people, and I think it's a lot of our societies have this pattern where people tend to feel like they're on their own. You're going to have to work out your issues, especially for us as men. Here, we're three men, but I'm sure people watching are men and women. But men are, and everybody's affected by this thing. Like, you've got to go get yourself together and not have these emotional problems. And I think one of the good messages of therapy, and you mentioned 12-step groups, which can be fantastic, is that you don't have to do this alone. Not only do you not have to do this alone, but you can't really do it alone. There's no way to recover from addiction or the impact of addiction, codependency, another term that's used. You cannot recover from these things unless you're in a supportive environment. And often these types of environments, like, you mentioned 12-step groups, and there are quite a few of them that help people with a myriad of issues, or in therapy or other type of religious groups, and there's many different ones. One of the things they do is kind of bust the shame by having an opportunity for people to share about what's going on in their life from a place of dignity and self-respect. I think that's one of the things that's impacted me the most in healthy 12-step meetings, is seeing the way people have talked about dealing with their addiction, and they're treating themselves like a fine human being, as they are, right? And as you would like to see ourselves. So I think this issue that it's not only, fear not, because addiction is profound and it will take you out. It's really deadly. But the good side is, once you get past the addiction, there's life there. And for many of us, 12 steps, they'll talk about beyond our wildest dreams or miracles that arise. And I don't want to scare anyone out with religious ideas, but it really does have that effect for many people, whether it's like, hey, I had no idea how wonderful my life could become. I thought I was just addressing this porn thing. And now I'm finding my life as a richness. I've gone back to get a graduate degree. My relationship is better than ever. I've got the black belt. I'm doing a career that I absolutely love. So it changes from a notion of thinking that we need to somehow control ourselves and recognizing that we're actually introducing ourselves to a wider world and an adult skill set that allows us to participate in a much more meaningful life. And that's what excites me. And that's why I'm really passionate about this topic.
You can support us in 2 ways. If you found this podcast to be helpful, you can support us in 2 ways. First, subscribe. This tells Spotify, Apple, Google, and everyone else that this is a useful podcast and it'll be shown to other people. Also, if you need further support with your relationship, visit us at relate.online, and there you'll find resources, articles, and access to professionals.
Yeah, and I love what you were talking about, like that energy boost, that sense, because, shame and addiction and compulsivity and secret, so much work, so much money, so much time. And so that sense of like, oh, I don't need to do this. Like, I feel lonely. I can dial a friend. I'm feeling sad. I can pet the dog. I can go for a walk. I can stop and just have tears. Like, as a guy to, make space to have those feelings. Now, again, a bunch of guys are thinking, I'm not turning into some tree hugging, crier or whatever, but that sense of just being able to be a human being in relationship, to feel sad, to have a bad day, that you don't always have to get it together. You don't always have to be perfect, all of that stuff is so critical. And yeah, the essence of shame is like you were saying, Dan and David, that it says, I'm not okay, I can't be in connection. And the message of healing is you are loved, you are valuable, you are worthy of respect, you are worthy of honor. Come into connection with all of you, the strong part, the powerful part, the resource part, and the vulnerable parts, and the parts that you don't talk about so much. And the thing that we discover in that context is just how amazing and how lovely and how just good those needs are. I have a story of a man I spoke with, as a much younger therapist, and this man had a habit around dressing up in women's clothing, which for me, this was the first time I had seen someone with the struggle, and so and in my head I'm thinking, okay, this is a little weird, and I don't really get that. And yet his story was that when he was a child, he was left at home from about the age of about 2.5 to about the age of 6. He would regularly be left for 4 to 6 hours at home, parked in front of the TV in kind of like a car seat, not strapped in, but just that was his kind of containment seat. And what would happen is as you know, the adverts would come on or something, and he would go and he would walk in to his mother's room, and he would open her drawers and basically run his hands through and run the you know, her lingerie, her undergarment, just, and you know, her dressing gown and stuff against his face for comfort, and also presumably the scent of her body for that comfort. And I mean, I was listening there as a therapist, just trying to hold back tears, because I could just, you know, that child's need for comfort, that need for connection, you know, there is an entirely, you know, wholesome, good, you know, something that, you know, that we want to be acknowledged. And the shame that he carried when he, you know, started to realize this compulsion or this longing to do this. And you know, my experience is that when we come into contact with the drivers of the behavior, what we see are these immensely human, immensely real, immensely connecting things. And yeah, and so and also when partners can see that, what that tends to grow with a sense of compassion. It reduces the fear, it reduces the anxiety, because you know, in that space, you know, that man in relationship, when his longing is to go there, that's a signal for his partner that actually what I'm looking for is comfort. I'm looking for connection, because sometimes, you know, as men, we get confused, and I'm going off on a diversion here. We get confused between sex and intimacy. So we think we want sex when really what we want is to be held or to experience comfort. And often, you know, in those same relationships, their partner's like, oh my God, he's always trying to fuck me, and I can't feel him. And so learning to say, oh, can I just have a hug, or do I have, you know, so it's not that I have to have sex in order to be close. So much to talk about this, and you know, and our plan is to, you know, to make some resources around this. But you know, if this is something that you're struggling with, you know, our longing is to kind of make a space where you can have these resources, but also meet with someone, you know, in the space where you are, because most people tend to discover this, and it's a big shock, and there's a lot of fear. And what we really want to do is create an opportunity for you to kind of sit down with someone like David, and just so you can step out of the shadows and just say, this is what happened. You know, he's not going to freak out. The odds are you're not going to tell him something he hasn't heard before. If you do, he's probably going to be really excited about that. But you know, you know, there is hope, there is support. You know, and that's really what we want. We want to offer him.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that, you know, maybe some people squirm in their chair when they hear such an intimate story about a man who was challenged back in his childhood. And it can be really difficult to hear those messages, you know. And for many of us, that's where these things come from. And I really like where you framed that, because in a way, it's like it starts off as something that's relatively innocent. Of course it is. This is a child who's being neglected and is turning toward these comforting behaviors in order to help him literally survive. And then later, and is often the case with addiction, where it starts off as something relatively innocuous or just something desperate choices that people make to provide themselves comfort in these very difficult situations. And it evolves into patterns that become addictive, and they lose control. And then then the shame comes in, because I think we tend to have a center around, well, why I should be able to have control, and I should, you know, what's going on. And maybe they lost track, like you say, of this initial thing that prompted that. And that's one of the great things about, you know, therapy and treatment and working a program of recovery. These things can all give you a sense of insight into these patterns and give you more of a sense of your humanness. And I think for anybody who's squirming to hear those types of, you know, potentially unsettling stories, I think that's a good kind of squirming in a way, because it reminds us that we're all human beings. And even though we may not need to revisit some of these, intimate childhood patterns that we experience in our life, sometimes we do. And sometimes we do need support to do that, and that's okay. Right. And I think that, for a lot of people, there's a sense that there's a real fear of giving up control or getting support and telling a therapist that they're challenged with these issues, or even telling their partner, someone that they trust, that they're having these issues, because they feel like it's going to open the dam. So they're going to lose control. Or I think you said it really well, Stephen, something along the lines of, oh, it's just going to turn you into a touchy-feely and you're never going to be a man. And that's not what we're saying. Like, we're talking about adults here. These are adults making choices, and striking that balance between, how do I maintain my strength as an adult? I'm a man here. I'm not playing like a child, but I am deeply affected by emotions, because I'm an emotional human being like anyone is. And I'm sometimes profoundly affected by emotional decisions I made as a child that have become persistent patterns as an adult.
Yeah, so I just want to start to bring us to a summary here. And let me first say, David, that indeed, statistically, most folks who have sex and pornography addictions are men. And also women do have these issues also. So what we're talking
Yes.
about is applicable to everyone.
Yes.
And then before I give you each a moment, to share your last thoughts, to bring a sort of summary, is that there is hope, and that there are ways to help folks, whether it is truly an addiction or whether it's a sign of problems in the couplehood, in the relationship. But either way, there is hope. And we have folks that are happy to help and talk if you need that. So that being said, gentlemen, last thoughts.
David, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. And I really do appreciate it. It gives me just so much pleasure to be able to help people deal with these kinds of issues, because, like we were saying, there is a great deal of hope. There is a possibility to get some significant change in life, not just to stop oneself from problematic behaviors, but to move into a new frontier of life with yourself and in a relationship that you're in. And to be fair to people, our society has a lot of sickness around sex and porn. I think it's important to name that, whatever your attitudes are toward pornography, that we're deeply affected by narratives that sort of invite people into believing that they have some fairy tale expectations for how their relationships and sexuality should proceed, and often run into a brick wall when it comes to how it actually manifests for them. But I think the good news is that nobody wants to live in a fairy tale anyway. We want to have our real lives. And by showing up for your life as it is and being willing to be an adult, getting support with other adults, that you can find that your life is much more manageable.
The opportunity and the resource of using the relationship as a gift, as a support, as a way to nurture both of you, and kind of healing from any kind of compulsivity or anything that scares or frightens your partner. It's not against you. It's not against your partner. This is for the relationship, and what is good for the relationship, is typically good for partners in the relationship. So, so thank you for being here, and thanks for having us, Dan. And
Gentlemen, thank you both so much. You see, relationships are difficult, and most of us, myself included, were not shown how to have a great relationship, so we had to figure it out. So Relate.online is trying to give you those resources. What we know is best practice for couples when they're going through therapy is to do an intensive. Well, the 2 days of intensive work with a therapist can be quite expensive. So how else do you get that information? So we created various online resources to allow couples to get that information. Second, after couples get their relationship going great, they're reconnected, they know that the improvements don't always last. And so it's necessary for the couple to stay involved and integrated and intentional. And that's where things like this podcast come in. It's an opportunity for you to kind of just check in on a regular basis and to make sure your relationship stays great. At Relate, our mission is to help couples create amazing, connected, and fulfilling relationships. Our music for today's podcast is Vanguard Jam by the group Rosier from Epidemic Sound via Canva.